The harsh June light scorched the square of Villa Esperanza when an exhausted body slipped through the ropes of the ring. It wasn't just any fall. That stumble signaled the start of a bizarre auction where desperate parents offered their 20-year-old daughter for 20,000 rays. Some townsfolk quickened their pace, pretending not to see, while small groups packed together so they wouldn't miss a single bid. Arms crossed, old farmer Elias Sampaio, the only landowner in the region, watched every face with calculated calm, waiting for the decisive moment. Standing on a slapped-together plank stage, the inspector raised his voice. The young woman, strong and healthy, would guarantee a good marriage. Behind him, a poster promised 25 novelties. Farther off, Robert Pimenta waved flammable goods around, making the powder's flames compete with the chatter. The bidding went on, and when the second offer, from Farmer Barros, rang out, the girl's face turned pale. Whispers of 30 novelties fired up the crowd's curiosity. Elias felt the moment slipping through his fingers. In a quick calculation, he decided to risk the money he'd saved from the last harvest. The auctioneer was still echoing 50 novelties when the farmer's voice cut through the buzz. 10 boys in white hats leaned forward, ready to hold him back, but he met the girl's father's stride with a steady stare and, bandana tied tight across his forehead, declared, 70 contos! In a second, the courtyard went still. The sun, hanging overhead, seemed to wait for the next move. In the middle of the yard, the inspector raised the golden gavel with a sweaty hand. His voice came out firm, but the quiver at the corner of his lips betrayed him. Anyone may place a bid. The small judge, half hidden behind the stand, nodded slightly, reminding everyone the highest offer had to stand. Right then, the girl who'd been motionless shifted. Her eyes met Elias's like someone spotting a door cracked open after a long stretch of darkness. 70 contos, the inspector repeated, and dust rose in a thick cloud. Silence. No hands went up. The crack of the gavel echoed. Sold. The ground seemed to vibrate. Elias stepped forward, heart racing, feeling in his stride the same hesitation that had followed him since Benedita's death. A clandestine photographer popped a flash, freezing the scene. Almost the same framing he kept of his wife, taken by fever a year earlier in a village with no doctor. Since then, the house had felt too big for one man alone. The young woman stepped down from the platform in short steps. Her old bracelets jingled, betraying her nerves. When they crossed paths, Elias broke protocol. "What's your name?" She swallowed hard. Clara Bastos." He straightened. "I'm Elias Sampaio. You know where we're heading." Shock spread across her face. The crowd closed in, voices rising like a wall. Clara let out a cry. She wanted a say in her own destiny. Elias stood still for a moment in the harsh atmosphere, feeling the weight of every stare. Clara backed up, tense, measuring her escape routes. They passed under the awning when Robert Pimenta's laugh rang from the balcony. 70 contos is way too much, Sampaio. This story's not over yet." The farmer pretended not to hear. They mounted the worn-out horse and headed for the start of the dirt road to Matungo Ranch. Lifting Clara onto the saddle, Elias noticed her shaking wasn't from fear. It was the expectation of someone sensing irreversible change. "I'm not here to hurt you," he murmured low enough for only her to hear. "I need you to trust me." For the first time, she held his gaze. There was no pleading or panic, just a kind of awe that spoke louder than words. "Why?" she breathed. Elias took his time to answer. He spurred the animal, delaying the moment. He knew all too well the weight of certain customs. As the weak lamplight of the village faded behind them, curious faces appeared at the windows, unaware of the small iron object Clara kept hidden in the hem of her dress. She felt its coldness against her skin, a reminder that, if need be, she still had choices. She smoothed her skirt and crossed her legs with the ease of someone who owns her space. Nothing felt out of place. The silence enveloping the village, once cut by the road of hope, seemed final. If any truth or quiet courage existed there, it would have to be found along that endless lane. The landscape spread out in shades of blue. The house was low, clean, almost mute. A narrow porch, a spring surrounded by stones and wildflowers. "Here we are," Elias said, climbing down slowly. It wasn't big, but, he assured her, no one would come looking for her there. Clara gripped the railing, her eyes searching for an exit like a bird sensing an open cage. Inside, a simple room. Elias said his son had lived there, the fever leaving a scar on his chest it wouldn't forgive. "Your son?" she asked. "Damien," he said. "He died still a boy when Clara was 5. In the kitchen, a coffee-stained table held the smell of old mornings. "This way," he called, pointing to the resting room. On a bench sat baskets just dropped off by Mrs. Aurora. The name brought back the memory of midwife Aurora Tellis, the same one who had helped deliver her mother. The cabin lacked luxury, but it offered everything needed. Rows of books, perfectly aligned, filled the oak shelves. On the old table, clean and solid, rested a small set of metal tools. Nightfall brought a faint scent of fermented cane, a warning that something was moving beyond the walls. "No hard feelings," Elias murmured. "Just 3 ranch hands combing the brush to the west, sent by Colonel Amancio. Hours earlier, 3 prisoners had escaped from Colonel Medeiros' ranch." Clara lifted her chin. "I'm not a prisoner." Elias answered calmly, "No one said you were," reminding her that the fugitives had been accused of stealing horses. Later, Clara watched him out in the orchard trying to save the irrigation that was drying up fast. There was no money in the house, nor any valuables, but something caught her eye. Several volumes of the Imperial Code covered in dense notes and notebooks from an old law professor. Twilight had barely settled when the sound of hooves broke the silence. 3 riders appeared on the trail. Clara recognized Robert Pimenta, Juvencio Barros, and a third man known for his swagger. Elias walked toward them with a steady step, his face uncovered. "Sampaio," Pimenta greeted him. "We've brought Dr. Gouveia, the newly appointed district judge." The tall man nodded, his eyes taking in every detail. "People talk a lot about you, Mr. Sampaio. We need to inspect this land." With boots stained with red mud, Judge Gouveia walked the yard talking about reforms, tax-free titles, and how the state could make fertile the plots that, in his view, were lying idle. Clara noticed Elias's jaw clench. He lifted his sunburned face and, without changing his tone, said, "This ranch has been in my name since 1869, every document stamped 3 times. Gouveia let out a short laugh. "Times change, Sampaio, and so do the laws." He left, leaving hanging in the air the old desire to take the land. Elias went back to work, pounding steaks as if the conversation were just dust. He muttered that there was something more precious out there than the clay beyond the gate. At noon, Donna Aurora Tellis showed up on horseback, dark-skinned in her 40s, her gaze weighing every silence. She brought beans, coils of rope, and a warning. The new judge went by 5 farms today, all run by dark-skinned folks, or almost. Elias pressed his hat against his chest, pure stubbornness. "I already knew," the midwife said, handing over an envelope that had just come in by telegraph. The message was from Adamar. Elias read it, and his expression hardened to a single purpose. He called, "Clara, I need you to tell me what you heard when your father was talking to Colonel Amancio Flores." Fear brushed the young woman, but Aurora cut in. "She's not the first woman we've tried to pull out of that family." Then, like a sharp blade, the truth opened up. Clara hadn't escaped by luck from that human auction where a girl could cost less than a mule. It was hard to tell what set off that blast. The shed where I kept the prototype went up in a flash, as if a shell had ripped through the tiles. I spun around on reflex. The old man had already shoved the red-covered notebook, with the drawing and notes, into the back of the cupboard. Fears, names, dates were scribbled there. Colonel Amancio, in cahoots with Dr. Gouveia, was making the most of the chaos. He was claiming a few plots near the river. Aurora, Elias's wife, watched it all in silence. "So the old man set up that contraption in the yard so everyone would notice?" she whispered. Clara didn't reply. She shrugged, like someone facing a semester that ends with no answers. She had heard too much, seen too much. In the village, she wrote, exhausted, the buzz was growing. People talked about the nations and the boldness of the recent purchase. At night, right by the railroad, the White Maiden and guests of uncertain purpose appeared under the slanted light of the lanterns. The mines, newly opened, were drawing people from everywhere. The little red book disappeared along with the old man. Enough of sending messages over the night telegraph, some said. Why did the big shots of Villa Esperanza stay quiet? They knew. Sometimes things slipped out. Yumbo could see further than the others. But the railroad revolution doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It starts in the bunks, amid muffled songs. Quill drafts get lost in the wind. What matters beats just ahead. Days after the victory, a guy in a lab coat came down Villa Esperanza's main street. It was Judge Gouveia, disguised as a pharmacist, but no one noticed. They welcomed him as a stranger. At City Hall, employees found, wrapped in sheets, tiny portraits enclosed in black cardboard, a sign that spies had been through. Clara Bastos was still locked up, chewing over memories like Elias's cattle. Meanwhile, Sampaio was trying to impose order in the town hall when the old box stolen from my father's desk finally ended up in the colonel's office. Warned, Elias showed up at the telegraph station with a package. Adamar, the operator, pointed to the basement where he kept sensitive material, and before disappearing, whispered that the line to the capital was clear. Elias was left alone at the machine, his pulse racing to the rhythm of Morse code. It was still dawn, the sun just hinting over the horizon, when Colonel Amancio Flores, Gouveia, and 3 wealthy ranchers knocked on Robert Pimenta's door. The air smelled of fear. "The papers evaporated," the colonel growled. "Documents don't just vanish." The judge straightened his tie, rattled. The glass cabinet was open, and the box wasn't there. Robert poured more cognac. The men, Sampaio included, whispered about problems. Amancio raised his hand, ended the conversation, and crossed the threshold without looking back. He'd promised he'd never return to City Hall empty-handed, and he kept his word. Of the 3 stolen copies, one vanished down the corridors, another turned into a display in the foyer, and the third sealed the chapel doors shut. Even so, Aurora Tellez's routine stayed intact. When she opened the cupboards that morning, between the hanging trombone and the cold brazier, she found the railroad earthworks plan, a document of high strategic value that should never have left the official vaults. Right at 10, the shattering of the stained glass echoed through the silent nave. Soon after, the whistle of a special train cut through the air and made the platform shake. 3 men in dark suits jumped off, an envoy from the State Council, an emissary from the Imperial Railway Company, and a journalist from a major newspaper. Elias was led down the main street under a shower of Voice of the People leaflets. At every corner, whispers turned into heated debate. The farmers, now alert, whispered about the crime hidden in Mr. Bastos's red book. Out of the dim storeroom stepped Colonel Amancio, his voice steady. "It's all lies." The inspector stayed calm and asked that the drawer be opened, suggesting a tweak to the original rail line toward the lowlands. Meanwhile, Juvencio Barros tried to step back when Inspector Noguera held a note up in front of him. "Did you know about this, sir?" he asked. "Everything in here?" Barros shot back, stunned. "Not yet," Noguera said. "But we're going over every line." With every minute, the square grew tighter. The young men who moments ago had shouted at Elias now glanced at each other, unsure, and cleared a path as if apologizing. In the confused back and forth, Clara came through the chapel door carrying Father Lino, his habit marked by the scuffle inside. The watchman, still pale, raised his voice. "This young woman gathered reinforcements against the abuses that have crushed us for years." The words froze Mr. Bastos. Clara held her father's gaze and stepped forward. The inspector moved between them. "She's no child, and she brought us the records you and the colonel hid. Farms, dates, 7 families exploited in the last 2 years." A messenger dashed off with a letter addressed to Judge Gouveia. The reporter, notebook in hand, wrote down every syllable. The Bar Association and the newspaper A Capital want to know how a simple law graduate can proclaim himself judge in a neighboring district. The colonel clenched his teeth. "This village is mine." He looked for an exit and found none. The railroad man, who had listened in silence, added, "The reports leaked early. Why was Procopio armed? Why does he always smell like gunpowder?" The crowd leaned forward. Bastos felt the weight of a silence that trembled with expectation. Eyes met. The air hummed with tension. Everyone waited for the next revelation. Clara stood her ground before the crowd. "Scared?" she shot without blinking. I grew up the day this place's honor was wounded. Cornered, Bastos dug in. And you? Still trust him? He bolted as soon as he heard I would face him without looking away. We're still alive because we yanked courage from nowhere. You've never buried the ghost you were born with. The silence broke with Elias's voice. Everybody pays the same price, Bastos. That was the foundation you tried to hide. Honor doesn't wear a label, but living together has rotted. A murmur swelled. Some confessed. Others, longtime acquaintances, chose the void. Stripped of his title, Elias now was summoned only for a moral victory. In a blink, a dialogue sprang up between a man and the rails. Elias, maybe the inspector, was measuring Sampaio's land. No one noticed the conspirator who slipped between Dona Aurora and Clara, the reporter hungry for quotes. From the village gate to the ridge top, a question hung in the corners of the square. All the people, especially the women, could do was resist. Someone controlled those shotguns. The answer slept in open books, torn pamphlets that clashed, and farther on, in the draft of an auction planned long ago. That plan, handed to a so-called world changer, a man with little schooling, came back 6 months later. The village, now renamed Esperanza, woke up different. At the station, among blueprints of white houses and a clock in flames, the outline of Elias's land finally appeared on paper. Sampaio sold the land, and almost without pause, imperial wagons opened the road linking the town to the coast. The clearing left by Colonel Amancio stretched to the border with no fence. Elias's house became an improvised school, 3 classes in one hall. Black boys were kept at the gate. Weeks later, the building got a government plaque and drew neighbors with paperwork in hand. In a quick ceremony, Clara Bastos, soon called Clara Sampaio, was applauded. Lino, the light-footed custodian, showed her every corridor, and she pushed doors open like someone testing futures. Suddenly, the air grew heavy. Under the floorboards ran a line of bribery that explained projects and favors. I never planned to teach, Clara told 20 little students, immigrant kids, in the Jatoba's shade. But I see my own story in that quiet girl. Elias slid new desks into place and laughed. I knew how stubborn you were. We needed a place where the soul could breathe. Far away, Colonel Amancio languished in prison for arson and abuse of power. Gouveia, the feared prosecutor, vanished. Rumor had her locked up in another province for burning records. Zacharias lost the shipyard and now unloads vessels at a distant dock. Bastos, Clara's father, lives on handouts, a shadow of the gold he once had. Amid the forge's roar, the blacksmith declared, "Time to free Master Vital." Every week, Aurora Tess gathers the crew who patched up the village, Adamar at the telegraph, Inspector Noguera, and the diehard who keeps hope's ember alive. Only the last page needed turning. The manuscript was ready. Vital, a teacher from the capital, had years ago found a crack in the laws of intelligence. He called it ex cauda data and swore to decipher it. That's what Elias wanted to buy, taking on a debt that would be paid only when the train arrived 10 years later. He agreed. Meanwhile, the school project took shape. Aurora the blacksmith kept the anvil hot. 15 scholarships for young Brazilians appeared. 15 lives changed. Clara shivered when her hand brushed by chance the bronze doorknob with the family crest. The memory flooded back whole. The next morning, the first steel train stopped at the freshly named Villa Esperanza station. There was little celebration, plenty of commotion. The new chief, elected in a rare, clean vote, spoke of progress, but his eyes searched for Sampaio and his wife in a corner. A woman, still marked by the hit-and-run months earlier, came to Clara and whispered, "My son got a job here. They'd never have picked him. It's because of you. You gave up your boy's gold, short in stature, now with a future." Across the platform, the young man raised his hand, uniformed, gazing at the tracks with tenderness. We left him there. Clara returned the gesture, a restrained smile, heart wide open. "The truth," Elias said on the way back, "never fits whole. All that's left is to build something new on the ruins." Clara stopped and looked over the village. The first lights were winking on in the windows. I was there, trembling like a beggar, asking forgiveness. Then she whispered, "I want to." That's when I realized. pain doesn't pick a face," Clara confessed. Elias sighed and in a calm gesture said that freedom isn't just about drawing perfect borders, but about widening the table until more people can fit. She held his gaze not out of defiance but out of conviction. We explained that none of it was ours. I was a traveler. You were the rightful heirs to this land. I added that guilt, stubborn as a noon shadow, would keep clinging to our skin. Ahead, the station's freshly raised towers slashed the fiery sky, a sign that the market was finally starting to spin the wheel beyond its old owners. In the warehouses where orders once echoed, classrooms, co-ops, and bookshelves were popping up, solid promises of a horizon that had seemed like legend just weeks earlier. Scattered old councils turned into weekly meetups where we polished ideas for the people. Almost no one understood all the mechanisms, but in the courtyard, soaked in an electric dusk, a young woman raised the auction gavel, selling something that still had no name. Fraud was circling true. Even so, that beat of hope could spark flames strong enough to guide thousands. Some called that spark a revolution, others just a beginning. The fact is, in that moment, everyone held their breath, waiting for the next step that would change history. The buildings are barely standing, and inside, they carry scars that won't heal. Even so, in the daily ebb and flow of that neighborhood, Elias and Clara raise something no stone can hold up: the worth that gives every face the same weight in the world. They reject the label that condemns anyone without property because they know the game is usually the same outside those walls. Instead of repeating the playbook, they swap the rules. Clara reminds the kids of the first day they sat in the makeshift classroom. Few remember, but as she tells it, she reignites the spark time tried to snuff out. Whenever the bulb flickers, the memory picks up new colors, as if the light swore to immortalize what's fleeting. Outside, the headlines announce crisis, but they also talk about people who found courage inside their fear. That's exactly where your heart needs to dig in the search for truth that exposes and heals, in the strength that pushes the soul against invisible currents. Clear the way for wide stories without cutting the root that holds you up. Dignity might feel abstract, yet it pulses in simple gestures. In the song you sing while you stack worn-out books, in the fight your body learned before it even understood the words. Keep your stride steady. Someone may try to muffle that sound, but it slips through closed doors and calls others to walk with you. Before you leave, take a deep breath and carry with you what's still echoing in here. The worth of every person and the flame that turns into light when no one else believes. If this story touched you, share it, drop a comment, and stay with us. Because the next part is already being written and every voice matters in this build. See you then.